In the small, peaceful town of Amstetten, 18-year-old, beautiful Elizabeth Fritzl suddenly disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The man imprisoned his own daughter for 24 years and turned her into a tool for satisfying his own sexual desires. At the age of 18, full of youth and with a bright future ahead, the girl could never have imagined that her life would become a tragedy worse than hell, as she was brutally abused by her own father. The evil father declared to the police that he was born to sexually assault. The case, with its deeply tragic details, shocked both Austrian and global public opinion. Before we dive into today's story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our latest videos. On August 28, 1984, in the small, peaceful town of Amstetten, 18-year-old beautiful Elizabeth Fritzl suddenly disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Rosemarie, Elizabeth's mother, was nearly driven to madness by her daughter's disappearance. The family searched everywhere, knocking on every door and asking every acquaintance, but no one knew the whereabouts of Elizabeth. In their panic and despair, the Fritzl family was forced to call the police, hoping they could help find the young girl. In the days that followed, the Fritzl household was enveloped in a tense and oppressive atmosphere. The family members were terrified at the thought that Elizabeth might have had an accident, or worse, been kidnapped and murdered. As each day passed, Elizabeth remained unheard from. The family gradually sank into despair, beginning to prepare themselves for the worst. Perhaps they would never see Elizabeth again. Then, unexpectedly, a letter from Elizabeth was sent home. The letter was a shock to the family members. The young girl wrote that she was tired of family life and had decided to run away. The scrawled handwriting and cold tone astonished Elizabeth's parents and siblings. Rosemarie read and reread her daughter's letter, unable to hold back her tears. The mother could not believe that her daughter could write such indifferent words. How could the obedient girl abandon her family without any explanation? She could not accept this. Her heart felt like it was breaking into pieces. Joseph Fritzl, Elizabeth's strict father, seemed calm about his daughter's disappearance. He told the police that Elizabeth might have been drawn into a mysterious cult. He mentioned that recently, his daughter had been following a group of strangers and showed signs of being brainwashed and rebellious. Joseph also said that Elizabeth had previously expressed a desire to live freely, away from the constraints of family life. As time passed, the family's hope gradually faded, and the searches came to an end. The family began to accept that Elizabeth had been enchanted by the mysterious cult and truly wanted to leave family life, as stated in the letter. About a month later, the police knocked on the Fritzl's door one gloomy afternoon, bringing news the family did not want to hear. The search for Elizabeth had officially ended with no results. Joseph Fritzl, with a sorrowful face, rose from the chair in the living room, walked to the door, and received the news with a look of sadness. He shook hands with each police officer, thanking them for their efforts, and then turned to comfort his wife, Rosemarie, who was sobbing, her shoulders shaking with despair. One of the officers, looking into Joseph's dark-circled eyes, asked once more, as a final attempt, "Do you think of any place where your daughter might have gone? Perhaps somewhere we haven't searched yet?" Joseph shook his head, his eyes moist, as if bearing a pain too profound to express in words. The police looked at the family with sympathetic eyes. They bowed their heads to the Fritzl family before leaving the house. The door closed behind them, leaving Joseph Fritzl standing in the living room, his face no longer showing sadness but rather a chilling coldness. Rosemarie sat still on the chair, her eyes filled with tears, unaware that her husband was hiding a horrific truth. Joseph knew exactly where his daughter was. In reality, Elizabeth had not gone anywhere. She hadn't left the house. She was just a few steps away from where the police were standing. Right beneath the house, just 6 meters underground, was a secret cellar. That was where Elizabeth was imprisoned, not by strangers or a sinister cult, but by her own father. Elizabeth's desperate screams could not penetrate the thick concrete, and the police left without knowing that the girl was desperately calling for help in the cellar right beneath their feet. Elizabeth was still alive, but not with the freedom everyone thought. She was living in an endless nightmare. At just 18, with a bright future ahead, Elizabeth Fritzl could never have imagined that her life would become more tragic than hell itself when brutally victimized by her own father. Rosemary Fritzl and Joseph Fritzl married in 1952 when Joseph was only 17 years old. They had 7 children together, 2 sons and 5 daughters, including Elizabeth. In the eyes of family and neighbors, Joseph Fritzl was like a model man, a dedicated engineer. Every day, Joseph regularly left the house, or if not, immersed himself in the workshop right below the basement. He designed and manufactured machinery and household items, and no one suspected anything when he spent hours working in the basement. Sometimes Joseph even stayed overnight down there, but no one found this unusual, as everyone thought it was where he devoted his passion and dedication to his work. However, few knew that behind this diligent exterior, Joseph was not just a skilled technician. For years, he had quietly planned a gruesome scheme that no one could have anticipated. The basement, where Joseph worked every day, was not just his workshop. Beneath the thick concrete, Joseph had personally expanded and created a hidden area completely cut off from the outside world. No one in the family, not even his wife, knew about this place. He meticulously and secretly built it with one sole purpose: to carry out the horrifying crime he had long harbored. On that fateful day, Joseph Fritzl, as a normal father, called his 18-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, down to the basement to help him bring a heavy door up to the garage. The young girl, with no suspicion, cheerfully responded to her father's request and descended the stairs into the dark basement. Elizabeth still trusted her father, unaware that this would be where her life would descend into hell. Entering the basement, the dim light reflected off the cold walls as Elizabeth chatted happily with her father, not noticing that he was silently observing her with an entirely different look. Joseph no longer looked at Elizabeth with a father's gaze, but with the gaze of a predator. The plan he had devised for months was about to be put into action. As Elizabeth was about to turn around to head back up the stairs, Joseph Fritzl suddenly lunged at her from behind. Before she could realize what was happening, he had covered her face with a cloth soaked in chloroform. Elizabeth struggled, trying to breathe, but everything began to spin. Her body quickly succumbed to the effects of the anesthetic, and everything around her faded until Elizabeth lost consciousness. Joseph stared at his unconscious daughter on the floor, without a hint of hesitation or remorse. He crouched down, coldly dragging Elizabeth's motionless body deeper into the dark basement, where he had spent months preparing. The heavy iron door closed behind them, sealing Elizabeth off from the outside world. When Elizabeth woke up, she felt her entire body heavy and aching. The surroundings were dark, with no light coming through, no windows, no sunlight. Elizabeth tried to stand up, stumbling through the dim room. Everything around her was truly horrifying. The basement was so cramped and damp that it was hard to believe. Each breath Elizabeth took felt stifled by the heavy air, and the musty smell assaulted her nose, making her feel incredibly uncomfortable. She had to crawl on her hands and knees through a passageway only 83 centimeters wide, so tight that moving felt like being crushed. Darkness enveloped her, as if it were swallowing the girl piece by piece. Elizabeth's mind was bombarded with unanswered questions. Why had her father locked her up here? Why was he imprisoning her in this hellish basement? Fear and confusion overwhelmed her mind, driving Elizabeth almost to madness. Suddenly, a strange sound came from above. She heard the siren of a police car, the voices of her parents, as if they were right outside. A glimmer of hope sparked in Elizabeth's mind. She could no longer stay calm. Elizabeth began to scream, calling for help with all her remaining strength. "Help me! Mom! Dad! Someone please save me!" Her voice echoed through the cramped basement, but then faded, sinking into the terrifying silence. Elizabeth tried to shout louder, her voice becoming hoarse, but it was all in vain. She continued to scream, but no one heard her. No one responded to her cries for help. Despair began to seep into her mind, slowly drowning the young girl. Elizabeth was only a few meters away from the outside world, but to her, it seemed as distant as another world. Elizabeth, helpless, Her body exhausted and her spirit broken, finally fell asleep. The next morning, Elizabeth was awakened by a rough hand placed on her shoulder. She jolted, her eyes wide with terror, her lips trembling as she struggled to contain the rising anger within her. Trying to regain her composure, Elizabeth immediately questioned her father, wanting to know why he had locked her in this filthy basement. Joseph did not answer right away. He stood still, coldly staring at Elizabeth from head to toe, his eyes cold and unfeeling. Then suddenly he spoke. Joseph revealed a horrifying truth to Elizabeth. Joseph informed her that the police would never search for her, and from now on, she would officially be his second wife. Joseph's words struck Elizabeth's heart like a knife. She could hardly believe what she had just heard. A surge of disgust and terror overwhelmed her, and she could not accept this terrifying reality. With all her fury, Elizabeth lunged at Joseph, her hands pounding against his chest, screaming, kicking and hitting wildly in a desperate attempt to fight back. But it was all in vain. Joseph remained unmoved, easily grabbing her arms, and in an instant, Elizabeth was thrown down onto the cold floor. He beat her mercilessly, without hesitation. Each time she tried to fight back, she received an even harder blow. Finally, when she no longer had the strength to resist, Elizabeth could only lie there, in pain, weak, and utterly powerless. Joseph tied Elizabeth's arms and legs tightly, the cold ropes digging into the young woman's flesh, rendering her unable to struggle. His eyes were filled with cruelty, while Elizabeth's eyes were full of terror and despair. The pain spread throughout her body, but the physical pain could not compare to the humiliation and degradation rising in Elizabeth's heart. Her mind was filled with a series of questions, unable to understand why the father she once respected and loved had now become such a beast. Why could he do this to his own daughter? A wave of disgust and outrage surged within her, but it could not change the horrifying reality before her eyes. The 18-year-old girl was becoming a tool to satisfy her father's depravity. Everything was horrific. Just a few meters above, in the family's house, Elizabeth's mother, Rose Marie, and her siblings sat there, unaware of what was happening right beneath their feet. They anxiously and desperately searched for Elizabeth, continually praying for her safety, but it was all in vain. No one knew that just a few meters away from their feet, Elizabeth was enduring the most nightmarish ordeal of her life. The sound of Joseph's heavy breathing filled the gloomy and cramped space of the basement, while Elizabeth could only bite her lip, tears streaming down her face, unable to believe the cruel reality. The humiliation and emotional pain were greater than the physical wounds. Elizabeth could do nothing but helplessly endure. For the first 2 years, Joseph maintained a horrific schedule, coming down to the dark basement at least 3 times a week, or even daily, bringing food for Elizabeth, not to care for her, but to keep her alive and strong enough for him to continue his depraved acts. The dusty, cold, and dark basement, devoid of any sunlight, was where Elizabeth was imprisoned for 24 years. Every night, Joseph would descend into the basement, not only to satisfy his perverse desires, but also to control every moment of the girl's life. Joseph ruthlessly turned Elizabeth into a slave imprisoned right beneath the house where she had once lived happily with her family. During those years, for Elizabeth, the basement was no different from a hell on earth, where every time she heard the door open, she knew her nightmare would continue. After the first 2 years in the basement hell, Elizabeth became pregnant with her first child, but tragedy struck when she miscarried after just 10 weeks. In 1988, Elizabeth became pregnant again, this time with a baby girl. Without any preparation or assistance, Elizabeth had to give birth alone in the dark basement on a dirty blanket, without any medical help or anyone by her side. During her pregnancy, the only thing Joseph Fritzl allowed Elizabeth was a book on childbirth, which was given to her just 2 months before her due date. As the delivery approached, Joseph threw her an additional blanket, as if that were all she deserved. Elizabeth had to deliver the baby under horrendous conditions, with only a pair of scissors and a few diapers as her tools. There was no pain relief, no medical support, and Elizabeth endured the excruciating pain of childbirth alone in the filthy basement. 10 days after the birth of her daughter, Kirsten, Joseph Fritzl finally came down to the basement to visit his daughter. Elizabeth had endured a painful and desperate childbirth without any help from her monstrous father. Joseph showed no concern for Elizabeth or the baby. To him, everything was under his control, as if Elizabeth and her child's fate were mere playthings in his hands. He decided everything, from what Elizabeth and her child would eat and drink to whether they would have access to medication. For an entire year, Elizabeth and her child were imprisoned in the basement without adequate medical care, only receiving sporadic aspirin and cough medicine as needed. Joseph controlled everything, deliberately keeping them in the most deprived conditions, as a constant reminder that they had no right to live like normal human beings. 2 years after Kirsten was born, Elizabeth gave birth to another child, a baby boy named Stefan. Both Kirsten and Stefan had to live in the dark, oppressive basement with their mother, a place devoid of sunlight, with stifling air and miserable living conditions beyond imagination. For these innocent children, their world was confined to the 4 cold walls, lacking everything. The meager amount of food Joseph brought down each week was insufficient to sustain the whole family, and gradually, both Kirsten and Stefan suffered from malnutrition. Their small bodies were unable to withstand such harsh conditions and, carrying the inbreeding genes, the health of both children was very weak. But despite all the difficulties, Elizabeth never gave up. She understood that her children needed more than just food to survive. She poured all her remaining spirit and strength into nurturing the 2 children. In the darkness of the cramped basement, Elizabeth taught the children to read and do arithmetic, so they wouldn't completely lose connection with the world of knowledge outside that they had never known. She wanted them to have a future, even if that future only existed in dreams. As Kirsten and Stefan grew older, the small space of the basement became overcrowded. Joseph, with his inherent indifference and cruelty, paid no attention to the overcrowding that the family had to endure. He forced his own daughter and the children to dig more tunnels, desperately expanding the space. The manual digging not only exhausted Elizabeth and the children, but also worsened their health conditions. But for Elizabeth, this was the only way to survive, and she had no other choice. During the 24 years of imprisonment, besides Kirsten and Stefan, she gave birth to 5 more children right in the basement, each birth being a battle between life and death. All of her children were born in desperate scarcity, with no doctors, no medicine, only loneliness and pain. One of the children could not survive after birth and died in her arms, in the damp, cold basement. As the children began to grow, the small basement became increasingly suffocating and overcrowded, unable to contain them all. Joseph began to fear that the existence of the children might be discovered, as one of them had a toe infection, causing frequent pain and loud crying. The baby's cries echoed continuously in the cramped space, making Joseph extremely anxious. He feared that the cries would escape outside, attracting the attention of the neighbors and thereby exposing the heinous crimes he had been trying to hide for so long. Therefore, Joseph planned to bring the 3 children to the surface to live with him and his wife. One chilly morning, before the sun had risen high, Rosemary, Joseph's wife, was in the kitchen preparing breakfast for the family. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Rosemary was startled, not expecting any visitors at this hour. She quickly wiped her hands on the towel hanging by the stove and hurried to the door. When she opened it, she was taken aback. Instead of a visitor, there was only a small, makeshift cardboard box neatly placed on the doorstep. Inside the box, a baby was carefully wrapped in a diaper, sleeping soundly. Rosemary stood in shock, her hands trembling as she bent down to lift the baby. The warmth of the child in her arms made her heart race, but her eyes were filled with worry and confusion. Next to the box was a neatly folded letter. She gently placed the baby into her arms and carefully opened the letter to read. As soon as she looked at the handwriting, her heart seemed to constrict. It was a letter from Elizabeth, her long-lost daughter. Rosemary froze, her eyes wide in disbelief at what she was reading. In the letter, Elizabeth wrote that this was her child with her boyfriend. She described her current difficult situation, stating that she could not care for the baby, and asked her parents to help raise the child in her place. Those brief lines made Rosemary's heart ache. Her daughter, whom she had loved dearly, had left home without a word and now returned only to abandon her own child for her to care for. Rosemarie felt a deep sadness. Her heart weighed down. Elizabeth's callousness was like a knife wound to a mother's soul. How could Elizabeth be so heartless? She had left her family, her mother, and all her loved ones to follow her own path. Yet, despite her sorrow, Rosemarie could not turn away from the baby. The child was innocent, unaware of the adult troubles that surrounded it. But Rosemarie was unaware that it was all a perfectly staged play by Joseph. With his cunning and cruelty, Joseph had created the found baby scene with no flaws. He knew well that Rosemarie would believe his forged letters, trust the story about the abandoned child, and think that Elizabeth was somewhere out there. Each time this scene was performed, Joseph maintained a calm, indifferent demeanor. He played the role of a grieving father who had lost his beloved daughter and now had to take on the responsibility of raising the innocent children Elizabeth had left behind. He appeared pitiful and worried in front of everyone, making everyone think he was enduring an irreparable pain. Thanks to this elaborate setup, Joseph fooled everyone. No one could have guessed that, right beneath their feet, in the dark cellar just a few meters away, Elizabeth, the daughter they thought had left home, was being imprisoned and brutally tortured by Joseph. Elizabeth had given birth to a total of 7 children, one of whom died in infancy, 3 living in the cellar, and 3 living above ground with their parents. The children and Elizabeth survived day by day in the dark cellar, relying solely on the meager food and water Joseph brought down each week. The cellar where Elizabeth and the children were imprisoned for decades was truly a hellish place. There was no heating, no fresh air, only cold walls and a tiny window that never opened. Surrounded by darkness and dampness, not a single ray of sunlight could penetrate. The electricity was often cut off, sometimes for hours, but at times lasting up to 10 days. Without electricity, water, or light, even cooking hot meals for the children became impossible. In the damp and dark conditions, the walls gradually became moldy, and the cellar turned into a haven for rodents. It wasn't until 1993, after Elizabeth and the children had lived in the cellar for nearly a decade, that Joseph Fritzl added 2 more rooms, equipped with a heater, a refrigerator, and a shower. But even with these slight conveniences, it remained a prison with no escape. The children grew up in darkness, knowing nothing beyond the moldy walls and the endless, eerie silence of the nights. Summer was the harshest time. The air in the cellar became thick and stifling, unbearably hot. The temperature from outside made the walls scorching, turning the cellar into a giant oven. Yet, despite the hardships, Elizabeth never gave up hope, still clinging to the dream of one day escaping this hellish place. Throughout the 24 years, Joseph continually reminded the prisoners that the cellar was rigged with gas traps and high-voltage electricity. They could die if they tried to escape. He threatened that if the cellar was breached, gas would flood in and kill everyone. To escape, Elizabeth would have to get through 3 locked doors. However, in reality, there were no traps as he claimed. How long Joseph intended to imprison Elizabeth was uncertain, but in 2008, an unexpected event occurred. After 24 years of suffering in darkness and pain, a surprising event changed everything. Kirsten, Elizabeth's 19-year-old daughter, fell into a critical health condition. With a high fever, delirium, and a weakened body, Kirsten could no longer endure the suffocating life in the cellar. With no other options, Elizabeth had to kneel and beg the cruel father Joseph to save her daughter. Though unwilling, Joseph could not ignore the serious condition of Kirsten. Reluctantly, he agreed to take Kirsten to the hospital. Naturally, Joseph could not allow everything to be exposed too easily. He fabricated a familiar story. Elizabeth sent a letter explaining Kirsten's condition and pleading for help. Kirsten was taken to the hospital, but her condition was too severe. The doctors couldn't determine the cause of her illness. All treatment methods seemed ineffective. Throughout that week, the police began to feel that something was off. They directly interrogated Kirsten about her family, but Kirsten, who had never seen the sunlight, was unable to answer. The girl had no memory of the outside world, and could not talk about a family she had never truly known. The doctors, after being unable to find the cause of Kirsten's illness, made an important decision. They requested the mother, the only person who could provide crucial information, to come to the hospital to help her daughter. At the same time, the police's suspicion grew. They revisited the mysterious disappearance of Elizabeth Fritzl years ago, examining the letters Joseph claimed Elizabeth had sent to the family. These letters seemed to have inexplicable discrepancies. Therefore, they decided to reopen the investigation. Under pressure from the hospital and the police, Joseph had no choice but to agree. It was the first time in 24 years that Elizabeth was allowed to step out of that hellish cellar. When Elizabeth arrived at the hospital, the police immediately approached her. Initially, Elizabeth was too afraid to say a word. The fear for the lives of her children still imprisoned in the cellar prevented her from speaking. She knew that even a small slip-up could lead Joseph to kill all the children. After hours of persuading and ensuring her and her children's safety, Elizabeth courageously recounted the entire horrifying story. The dark secrets she had endured for 24 years were finally revealed. This was the moment that ended her hellish days under the hands of the devilish father, Joseph Fritzl. On that fateful night, as Elizabeth's testimony was presented, Joseph Fritzl, who had imprisoned and abused his daughter for 24 years, was immediately arrested. This horrific case shocked the entire nation of Austria. But not only did Joseph face the severe consequences of his crimes, Rosemarie, his wife and Elizabeth's mother, was utterly devastated upon learning the truth. The woman who had always trusted her husband and never suspected anything suddenly fell into panic. The house she had lived in for so many years, which she thought was a home, now became the scene of brutal crimes. The fact that the husband she trusted and lived with had deceived, concealed, and committed heinous acts right beneath their house was unbearable for her. Immediately after the police arrested Joseph, Rosemarie quickly left the haunting house. In her mind, the questions relentlessly tormented her. How could she have not noticed? How could Joseph deceive her for so long? The police, after thorough investigation, believed that Rosemarie and those living in the apartment were completely unaware of the crimes Joseph had committed. The cellar where Elizabeth was imprisoned was built and designed in such a secretive way that there were no clear traces for anyone to detect. Joseph had cleverly concealed everything, from installing iron doors to fabricating fake letters from Elizabeth. Neighbors, friends, and local authorities were also shocked by the horrifying truth, a secret that had been hidden for so long that no one could have suspected. The evil father quickly faced appropriate justice. Elizabeth and all 6 children received maximum support from the Austrian authorities to rebuild their lives and relearn how to be normal again. All personal information and family photos were kept confidential. Although over 50 years old, Elizabeth still had no new photos since she was 16. Their residence was kept secret and referred to as Village X.
That night, Dad used a belt to beat Mom, then broke her neck. Dad also broke all of Mom's legs and put them in a bag along with her organs. I don't understand why Dad did that.
The children, with their clear and innocent voices, recount the story they witnessed. These are just children's words, but they paint a horrifying picture of a brutal murder case, a case that gives the police a headache due to its many strange details. It is only when the dead person returns that the secrets behind the horrifying murder case are revealed. Before we get to today's story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the latest videos. In a small house on the outskirts, Marie Clinton, a 41-year-old middle-aged woman with brown hair starting to gray, paced nervously. It had been over 2 months since she last saw her only daughter, Rosie, who was 24 years old. Her anxiety grew as no one in the family could contact Rosie, as if she had completely disappeared from the world. Although Rosie's absence made her uneasy, her son-in-law David continued to insist that his wife had left the house. However, Marie could not accept that her daughter had left without any explanation. One afternoon, when David was out at work, Marie decided to take this opportunity to uncover the truth. She visited her 2 grandchildren, Emma and Sam, who were only 6 and 7 years old. She called them into the living room, sat down next to them, and tried to keep her voice calm as she gently asked, "Where has your mother gone?" The children looked at their grandmother, unaware that their answers would terrify the adults. Emma innocently replied,
Dad took Mom's head off.
Marie felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She was horrified and shaken by the child's words. She could not fathom how the children could say such a thing. Trembling, Marie stood up and left David and his wife's house. Days passed with no sign of her daughter, and Marie's family began to feel increasingly uneasy. She decided to ask her son-in-law David about her daughter's whereabouts. But David, with a cold expression and disinterested tone, replied that he didn't know where Rosie had gone after they had an argument. "I've already reported it to the police. You don't need to report it again," David said, with an oddly calm demeanor. David's words only intensified Marie's growing suspicion. How could her daughter have disappeared so suddenly without any reason? Even if she had left, she would still contact her parents. Marie decided she had to uncover the truth. On October 5th, Marie decided to visit her grandchildren again to verify what she had heard from them. The feeling of anticipation and worry enveloped her as she started the conversation with Emma and Sam, who were still too young to fully grasp the seriousness of the situation. The children, with their clear and innocent voices, began to recount the story they had witnessed. Emma, with a serious expression, recalled that on that night, her parents had argued loudly. Her father was so angry that he used a leather belt to hit her mother. Emma's voice trembled as she continued. That night, her father also twisted her mother's head down, and after that, they didn't see their mother anymore. Sam, sitting beside her with a confused expression, added to his sister's account, saying that their father also broke all of their mother's legs and put them into a bag along with her internal organs. They found it very strange to see their father doing that. Sam added with a serious face, "Dad also told us to say that Mom left home for another man." Just the words of children, seemingly innocent and simple, painted a terrifying picture of a murder case. Marie, sitting beside her two grandchildren with a heavy heart, could not help but shudder as she heard the gruesome details from them. Unable to contain her anxiety, Marie immediately used a tape recorder to document the accounts of her grandchildren, intending to use them as evidence for the serious matter she had just uncovered. After completing the recording, she did not hesitate and went straight to the police station to report the case. When the police listened to the recording from the Clinton children, they did not dare delay even for a minute. On October 16th, police officers quickly arrived at the gate of the kindergarten where Emma and Sam attended. David, Marie's son-in-law, was waiting to pick up the children. The presence of the police created a tense atmosphere. David, looking confused and bewildered, was immediately taken to the police station for questioning. Determined to clarify the serious murder case, the police began a detailed investigation to verify the information from the recording and ensure that all evidence related to the case was thoroughly collected. David had no idea what was happening to him as the police led him into the interrogation room. Upon hearing that he was suspected of killing his wife, David immediately proclaimed his innocence, his face showing clear signs of panic and worry. David continuously insisted that there was no reason for him to harm his wife. He said that on July 14th, he and Rosie had a big argument, during which she proposed a divorce. After the argument on July 16th, Rosie left home. David insisted that, to his knowledge, his wife left the family home of her own accord without any interference from him. He also stated that the incident involving his children, testifying that he removed their mother's head, was completely false. David appeared confused and could not understand why his children would make such a terrifying claim. David continued to assert his innocence and demanded a clear explanation of the accusations against him. Despite David's repeated claims of innocence, the police could not overlook the suspicions surrounding him. For over 3 months, Rosie's whereabouts and her family's behavior had revealed many unexplained points of suspicion. Rosie and her family had always been very close. She made it a point to visit her mother's home every day, which had become an essential part of her daily routine. However, on July 12, 1988, when David returned from his business trip, it was unusual that Rosie did not go with him to her mother's house as usual. Marie, Rosie's mother, had called and invited her daughter over for a meal, but Rosie declined, claiming she was busy and could not come to her mother's house. On July 15th, Rosie asked her father to loan her $286. This was the last contact between her and her father, and there has been no further communication since then. Ultimately, it was truly inconceivable for anyone who had not witnessed the scene firsthand to understand how two children, not yet 5 years old, could describe such specific and horrifying details. Their accounts of David's cruel and terrifying actions only deepened the police's suspicions. Marie, David's mother-in-law, stood before the media and the police with a face full of pain and indignation. She not only felt heartbroken but also furious at her son-in-law's malevolent behavior. According to her, Rosie, at the age of 19, became pregnant with her first child and, despite her family's objections, decided to marry David. She had hoped for a happy future, but little did she know, just 4 years later, Rosie discovered his true nature. When she decided to leave him, she was brutally murdered. The mother could not contain her emotions when speaking about the man who turned her daughter's life into a nightmare. Marie's words not only exposed David's brutality, but also highlighted the pain of a mother who lost her child, leaving everyone who heard them feeling deep sorrow and sympathy. Although public opinion and Marie both insist that David is guilty of killing his wife, the police have not yet been able to charge him. Rosie's body has not been found, so the investigation cannot conclude that this is a murder case based solely on Marie's testimony and public suspicions. The police have launched an extensive investigation, focusing on searching for evidence at locations David had frequented, as well as his current residence. They meticulously combed through every corner, from David's old house to the surrounding areas, hoping to find any traces or clues related to Rosie's death. However, all efforts seem to be in vain. The searches yield no results, and Rosie's whereabouts remain a major mystery, an unanswered question. Just when the investigation seemed to be at a standstill, a new detail unexpectedly emerged. A tenant who had rented David's old house came forward to recount a terrifying experience he had encountered. According to the tenant, upon moving into the house, he discovered several bags of rotting meat in the refrigerator, emitting a terrible odor. He thought it was just ordinary spoiled meat and promptly threw the bags away without further inspection. This information raised suspicions for the police. Could these bags of rotting meat be Rosie's body? Despite the suspicion, the discarded bags of meat left the police with no means to verify whether they were crucial evidence in the case. At the old house, the police discovered traces of blood, which was enough to indict David for murder. However, the most crucial point is that Rosie's body has still not been found, which continues to complicate the investigation. The police began to shift their investigative focus, suspecting that David might have buried the body elsewhere. During the investigation, they recalled the two children, Emma and Sam, who had initially introduced the case with their terrifying testimonies. They decided to continue questioning the children, hoping to extract more information from their remaining memories. The interrogation was conducted carefully, with investigators trying to jog the children's memories. This time, their answers left the police astonished. Emma and Sam provided additional details that had not been mentioned before.
Dad took us with him to bury Mom.
The shocking testimony from Emma and Sam left the police in disbelief. The information provided by the two children not only pointed to a specific location where the body was buried, but also detailed the events that occurred early that morning. According to Emma and Sam, early that morning, their father drove them to Hocking Hills Park. This is where David often worked as a taxi driver when he wasn't on the boat. While they were locked in the car, they witnessed a terrifying scene, their father digging a hole to bury their mother's body. The horrifying details about their mother's death, as recounted by the two children, sparked a strong wave of sympathy from the public. Many people felt heartbroken for the two children, and some criticized the police for continuously bringing up their traumatic memories during the investigation. They were concerned that this could cause deep psychological harm to the children, as they were repeatedly forced to recall such brutal scenes. However, alongside this sympathy, There were also many who expressed doubts about the accuracy of the testimonies. The highly specific details provided by the children, who were only 4 and 5 years old, led many to question whether they truly understood the concept of dismemberment and murder. Children of this age are often not capable of grasping complex concepts fully, and their stories may be influenced by imagination or misunderstanding. For the police, these doubts were not unfounded. Nevertheless, in order to solve the case quickly, they had no choice but to rely on the children's statements. The police brought David along with the 2 children to Hocking Hills Park to excavate the location believed to be the burial site of Rosie's body. Despite the meticulous and thorough excavation, they found no traces of the body, no fragments of bone, no pieces of flesh, or any signs indicating the presence of a body. The police began to doubt the reliability of the children's testimonies. They suspected that Rosie's body might not be at the location they had indicated. If the children's statements were incorrect, did Rosie, whom the police were searching for, actually die? Had the children really witnessed their father killing their mother?
Dad took Mom's head off.
The chilling statement from the children still echoed in the investigators' ears. Yet despite their efforts, the police had not found any clues related to Rosie. It seemed as though she had completely vanished. New evidence began to surface, with a few acquaintances of Rosie coming forward to testify, providing notable information. Some of Rosie's neighbors claimed they had seen her appear on days after the alleged incident. However, none of them could provide specific information about locations, which further confused the investigators. In total, more than 5 witnesses confirmed that they had seen Rosie alive after the time David was accused of killing her. These testimonies created a significant contradiction with the previous evidence. While the police struggled to unravel the complex details of the case, they unexpectedly received a strange phone call. On the other end of the line, a female voice claimed to be Rosie. During the call, the woman remained calm and asserted that she was in the South and had not been killed or dismembered by her husband, as alleged. She demanded that the police stop investigating the case and hung up immediately afterward. This call left the investigators stunned and unsure of what to believe. They wondered whether the call was genuine or just a prank. To clarify, the police decided to call back the number they had just received. The police requested that the woman, if she was indeed Rosie, come to the station to verify the information. However, despite repeated attempts to contact and request her appearance, the woman refused to show up, complicating the case further. Another week passed, and the police still could not find any concrete evidence proving that Rosie had died from an accidental cause, nor could they prove that David, who was in custody, was the murderer. They also grew increasingly doubtful that the children's testimony was truly based on witnessing a bloody scene, or if someone had deliberately coached them to say so. The police met with the 2 children again. This time, they were no longer calm and asked urgently, "Is it true that your dad killed your mom?" To their surprise, Emma and Sam shook their heads and said they didn't know. This answer from the children contradicted their previous statements. When the police continued to ask who had taught them to say such things, the 2 children merely looked at each other and then turned to the police and nodded. The chilling case, built on the statements of these children, left the police grappling with an unclear situation, unsure of which direction to take in their investigation to uncover the truth. The mystery surrounding the case grew more complicated as Rosie, the woman allegedly murdered, completely disappeared and refused to come forward to clarify matters. The children's testimony, though inaccurate, raised suspicions of a possible murder. Why would a living woman let the circumstances of her supposed murder become so chaotic without coming forward to clear things up? The situation became even more serious when Rosie's over 4-year-old daughter was involved in a car accident and had to be hospitalized, yet her mother still did not appear. After all, if someone disappears without a trace, it is expected to see either the living or the dead. But how could someone simply vanish from the world? Years went by, and Rosie continued to be absent without a single trace. Rosie's family was understandably disheartened, and David, facing the unclear fate of his wife, could not escape criticism. However, finally, in February 1993, after nearly 5 years of tension and mystery, the The case that seemed to have no end finally reached a resolution. Rosie, the victim the police had been searching for all these years, reappeared, and to everyone's astonishment, she was still alive. Not only had she survived, but Rosie was also thriving with another man named John and had a 2-year-old child. It turned out that after years of an unhappy marriage with David, Rosie met and fell in love with John. She decided to leave her old life behind and start anew with him. The relationship between the two grew increasingly sweet, but there was one thing John did not know. Rosie had been married before and had a child. Rosie feared that if John learned about her past, he would leave her. Therefore, she chose to keep her true identity secret for a long time. She ignored the fact that this murder nearly landed her ex-husband in prison and that her daughter was hospitalized due to an accident during that time. She was determined not to come forward. Before disappearing, Rosie meticulously planned her departure. She taught her children how to describe the case and pretended that she had been murdered. Rosie hoped that by creating a fake murder, she could live a new life with her lover without being discovered. With everything arranged carefully, Rosie lived her new life, leaving her family to struggle through the chaos and anguish. As a result, her ex-husband sought to prosecute her and her new partner for their actions. Rosie also faced severe criticism from the public. As for the two children, they could only hope to forget the family tragedy and live on with strength. Thank you for listening to today's case story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more intriguing cases on our channel.